The more progressive approach to looking at Italy's history is to look back and think critically about slavery, about colonialism. So how are those two things coexisting right now in Italy?
That's a very good question.
Are they at all?
Yeah. I mean, the history of slavery in Italy is even more unknown than the history of colonialism. That's one thing. But I wanted to say, the argument I make in my book about colonialism is that mobility is key, and specifically the control of mobility equates to the way that empire functions. Right? If you can control movement, then you control. The control of movement is the control of power over people, right? Mm-hmm. And we see this in, historically there are many examples, but even today, if we look at these materializations that spatialize the control of movement, I'm thinking like the border wall at the southern part of the US, you're trying to control the movement of people from one place to another. I document the ways that mobility and the control of mobility became the fulcrum of empire in Italy's colonial history, and how that becomes expressed again in the migration crisis. Because, for example, with Maloney, again, it's about controlling movement of people and blocking or shunting or detouring or displacing or dispossessing. Right? These are all part and parcel of empire. Right, and specifically this idea that comes from these anthropologists, Ann Stoler, Carol McGranahan, and Peter Perdue, what they call imperial formations. These are the processes of empire that still exist, and I think Ann Stoler puts it as that persist and exist in the subsoil. They saturate the subsoil of people's lives, and to the point where we might not even be aware of it. Right? And so I was interested in the way that these processes of dislocation, displacement, and dispossession, as well as this exercise of power to block movement, to control movement, how that resonates between colonialism and migration in the present. With the dynamic of slavery, I'm excavating the layer that I see as lying beneath Italian colonialism, beneath Italian imperialism. That is another type of control of mobility, right? If we can think of slavery as those who are moved by force, who are coerced to move, not of their own will, like that is absolutely the dynamic inherent in it. So I'm looking at slavery as a set of coerced mobilities. And in Italy, there were many histories of slavery. I'm particularly interested in the period between 1500 and 1800, which would be sort of Barbary Coast slavery, which also is maps right onto the transatlantic slave trade. So there's this moment, particularly in 1600s, where there's trans-Mediterranean slavery happening with transatlantic slavery. There's a great book by a scholar named Stephen Epstein called Speaking of Slavery. And he looks at the language around slavery in Italy, and in fact, our word ciao, right, that we know of, right, ciao, everybody knows the word ciao, actually derives from the Venetian dialect, and the word is sciao. And that word means slave, because in Italian, the word slave is schiavo. So schiavo, sciao, ciao, because it was used as a greeting, as if I am a slave bowing down to you. And Venice itself was a hub for the trans-Mediterranean slave trade, and the slave trade from the East as well. So even today, this idea of slavery, through the word ciao, that millions and millions of people use every day, still persists, and yet we're unaware of it. So my new project is excavating that legacy, and in particular, I'm interested in various dynamics of slavery in Italy. So part of these fellowships that I won, I'm going to Genoa, which was, it's a port city on it's the capital of Liguria, which is on the Tyrrhenian Sea, so across from Corsica. and just south of Turin and Milan, it's on the coast. And I had not spent much time there, but Genoa, back in the day, was a maritime powerhouse. So one of the dynamics of slavery that I'm interested in are these, what we would consider to be Italians, who were kidnapped from places like Genoa and Venice and essentially held in slave prisons known as bagnios on the Barbary coast. And unlike the institution of slavery here in the US, manumission was possible insofar as these captives could write home and they could ask for money to essentially buy their freedom. And what happened in Italy from the 1600s and the 1700s, that places like Genoa and Venice, which were republics in themselves, they essentially created state departments of slave ransom. So it'd be like having, you know, a Department of Homeland Security, except now this is the Department of Slave Ransom. And these departments were responsible for raising money and negotiating the release of their imprisoned, compatriots. And it was a pretty big network of slave ransom and redemption, right? It was called redenzione, and there was certainly a Christian element to it, but it was this idea of rescuing slaves and bringing them home. There are documents that Muslim slaves and African slaves are still in places like Rome and Naples up until the 1850s, so even the decades before, just before Italy becomes a nation state in 1861. There's actually some historical overlap between the ends of what we would consider slavery and the beginnings of European colonial imperialism. And I'm looking at that overlap. What is it that ties them together? And I think it has to do with something, this idea of redemption and this idea of saving, rescuing slaves, that we see this entire network of departments of slave ransom spring up. And we see that kind of orientation towards salvation. And I'm looking at how that might relate to this idea of a civilizing mission, which is, one of the rhetorical justifications for European colonial imperialism, that these are, the stereotypes are these are uncivilized, barbaric savages. We need to bring a civilization to them. It is our moral and material duty to do so. I'm investigating the links between those dynamics of salvation and redemption. What is that relationship? So I don't have an answer to that yet, but that's the thinking that I'm going to be doing. And I'm hoping there's some archival evidence. So I'm going to go look in the archives in Genoa. There's some colonial archives that are there as well, where I'm going to look at the documents around civilizing mission.
Academia prides itself so much for being on the cutting edge, and I can't say this enough. This is a conversation that is pertinent, that needs to be happening, and it doesn't quite seem, at least personally, that it's happening to the extent that it should be. What do you think your role as an academic is?
Well, that is
within these conversations.
I appreciate the compliment, but I don't think I can take full credit for it, because I think there's a lot of really great work being done in Italy by activists, particularly activists of what is known as the seconda generazione, the second generation. And so the seconda generazione, the second generation, does a lot of activism around citizenship, around raising awareness of this colonial past, around raising awareness about the racism that has emerged from this colonial past. Italians of African descent, Italians of other ethnicities, that Italian doesn't have to be linked to this singular idea of whiteness or race. So that, I give due credit to that.
I'm so happy to hear about these activism groups and what work they're doing, and the fact that you are trying to connect with them. So insofar as what you've observed that they do and what you've researched so far, what do you think Italy as a nation still has to reckon with historically?
Wow. reckoning wouldn't be quite the word I would use, but I would say there is a paucity of vocabulary around race, around racism, right? The word razza is, still there's no kind of nuance that one might expect. Like, you don't really hear the word ethnicity, for example. I think debates about race are really important, and in Italy, I'm not sure the vocabulary is even there yet to have the kind of complex and nuanced debates that need to be held around this topic.
Right. I think it's interesting that you are an academic in the US looking across the Atlantic and trying to uncover all these nuances with Italy's history and trying to just uncover the truth that we haven't been really talking about. And so that's going to lead me back to the fact that you're a professor of transnational Italian studies. And so that is a relatively recent major at UCSB. Correct me if I'm wrong. It began in 2020. As the department promotes it, they say like it is quite complementary to the Italian language major. So can you talk about the sort of evolution of the transnational Italian studies major as a professor, and then also why is it complementary to be learning about culture alongside language?
Great question. So yes, we inaugurated the transnational Italian studies major in 2021. We just graduated our first majors last year, so just in the span of 2 years, we've already had some majors come through the program. And transnational Italian studies is a burgeoning field, and UCSB has the only major in the US of transnational Italian studies, but it is a growing field. And what transnational means is that we don't study Italy in isolation, right? We study the development of this idea of Italy as a nation state, as a culture, its history, its language, in relation to other histories, cultures, places, and languages. So we have, again, traditionally, this is, not recently, but traditionally an Italian major had been very literature focused, which we still include in our transnational major. So I teach a course on Italian travel literature, for example. But we really are looking at Italy as a cultural construct that has developed in relation to all of these other places and histories and languages. So we designed it as a double major, so if you're taking global studies or history, it's an easy specialization to pick up in addition to that. As an American myself, I have always studied Italy from abroad, looking at it. And in some ways, I'll put it in dialogue definitely with the US constantly, but also with other places and cultures and languages. So if I could sum up transnational Italian studies, it's just that. We are in dialogue, we're in conversation, we're in translation between cultures, and I think that gives a very rich kind of portrait or rich sense of this place that we call Italy.
Wow. I would just like to remind any students watching, Professor Hom teaches transnational Italian studies, gastronomic Italy, Italian colonialism, the art of translation, race, and Italophone literature, among many other Italian upper division courses that do apply to the majors that you've just talked about. The last thing to say is thank you so much.
Well, grazie mille. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.